welcome to this really happy occasion. I'm really glad to see so many people here. It really is like the academic equivalent of a wedding. And so I know it's going to be a really happy audience, and we're going to give Jerry lots of cheers for the amazing achievement that she's had. So just to give a little introduction, last week I was doing a kind of peripatetic thing of the department, going to all the different outlying groups, and I was very honoured to be able to go to Jerry's lab in Whiteton Woods, in the Whiteton Field Station, and meet her team, and really be inspired by all the work that was being done there. I saw bees navigating mazes and showing how clever they were, saw bees eating off artificial plants, showing how unclever they were. I saw some hives out sleeping in the cold air, and I met some of the people and was really interested and excited by the work that Jerry and her team are doing. What inspires me particularly is how interdisciplinary it is. So she's doing behavior, she's doing physiology, she's doing evolution, adaptation, she's doing the relationships between plants and bees, and so, you know, really covers the whole spectrum of biology, which I thought was really exciting. Now to get on to some of the CV stuff, which is much less exciting than actually thinking about the real work, but it's impressive nonetheless. She had a botany degree in the University of Wyoming, which now she's in the zoology department, albeit briefly until it becomes biology. Just shows the range of the interdisciplinarity and the fact that she started with botany and then moved into animals. Then she had a Rhodes Scholarship, which then took her to zoology in Oxford with Steve Simpson and David Raubenheimer as her supervisors. She then went back to the States, to Ohio State University to do a postdoc in bees with Brian Smith. Her first academic post was then at Newcastle University, and she came back to zoology in Oxford in 2018 as an APTF and now as the Hope Chair. So that's impressive, and however, other things are also impressive, and I think Jerry's energy, innovation, her entrepreneurship and her dynamism comes out when you think about all the other things that she's done. So she's got a successful startup, for example, manufacturing bee food for the apiculture industry, which could become really, really impactful. She's been on TV a couple of times, and my sources say that without her knowledge, she was featured 2 nights in a row on the Great British Menu, which is surely fame at last. Filmed in a freezing cold field during lockdown, and she didn't even know she was on there until her friend rang her up to say she was on TV. Her very first TV debut, which I think I need to find out about later, was on Titchmarsh's Love Your Garden. So that sounds interesting. She's done all sorts of outreach, for example, teaching in Chile, to teaching students to train bees, and many, many other things, alongside this really high-quality research that just cuts across boundaries, which we're going to hear about today. And I've got a couple of things about her likes, just to give a kind of thing of the person, which is she likes the desert and she likes the mountains. And there you are, that's interdisciplinarity in a nutshell. So I'm very excited to hear what Jerry's got to say, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, EJ. And thank all of you for coming to this lecture today. It's funny how life goes in a circle. I came here a very long time ago, and the first place that I came to in Oxford was a natural history museum. So it's, to me, feels fitting to come back here to speak to you today in my inaugural lecture as the Hope Chair. I'm speaking to you today about something that I think is very important. When I chose the title and the topic of this lecture, I could have spoken about the research of my lab and the work that we're doing. And I love the work we're doing, and I feel really grateful to have the position that I have to be able to do that work. But I felt instead it was important, given the time that we live in and certainly this particular week, to speak to you about bees and biodiversity loss, because I think that we're at a point in our history on this earth that we really do need to consider our ways and think seriously about the future for our children, as well as ourselves. So what I want to do to start this lecture, though, is to give you a bit of the history of the lecture itself, which I found fascinating as I learned more. So Frederick William Hope was a very interesting person. He was a student here at Christ Church. He was born in 1797, and he came here in 1820, and he studied classics at Christ Church. He afterwards became the curate of Frodesley in Shrewsbury, or near Shrewsbury, but he retired early due to ill health. Now, Hope was a clever person, and he'd grown up in the center of London, and then he came to Oxford. And I guess you can imagine, what a vibrant and interesting life he might have led in Georgian England in the early 19th century in the middle of London. Then he was sent out to this parish way, out basically in the sticks, and I think that it didn't suit him. He came back to London, and he focused himself on interests that he had started when he was here at Oxford on natural history and entomology. He knew Ellen because she lived in the same area of town, and I'm sure they all socialized in the same circles. And she was born at nearly about the same time as him, just a few years later. It turns out that Ellen was also a very keen natural historian who she had an offer of marriage from Benjamin Disraeli, but thought that politics might be too boring, and so chose a natural historian instead. So they married in 1835. Actually, she was quite old for the time that she married, and they had no children. But they were both keen natural historians, and they loved insects, and they made this massive insect collection, which filled up their house, and loads of people used to come to see their insect collection. This was before there were museums where you could come and see this sort of thing. So they had this huge insect collection. And Frederick Hope was a really keen entomologist, and in particular very interested in beetles. So he was a very good scientist and spent quite a long time describing beetles. In the 19th century, the world had really expanded for Britain. They had colonies everywhere, and they were seeing fauna and flora throughout the world that had never been seen in Britain before, or in Europe. And people were really excited about the discoveries that they were making on all these different animals and plants, and they were bringing them back to Britain and just starting to describe all these weird species and filling up their houses with this stuff. He was well known enough that he was elected to the Royal Society in London and also to the Linnaean Society, but he was the founder of the Royal Entomological Society and also one of the co-founders of the Zoological Society in London. So he was really in the thick of natural history in London at the time. And he was also a friend and teacher of Charles Darwin, so he was about 12 years older than Charles Darwin, and apparently Darwin liked to go to his house to learn a bit about insects, and they even did some collecting in the field. So imagine yourself back in the early 19th century. And I was thinking about the time, actually, when I started to construct this talk. It's a time when the romantic sort of explorer was in, and you had all these naturalists, and to be a young man who was studying at university, this was not something that women did, but as a young man studying at university was a big deal, especially if you had the wealth to become a natural historian, to go and collect animals and go off on a voyage across the world to a far-flung place. So you have all these romantic people who are poets and they're really very interested in the world outside. And they went to the far-flung corners of the earth, and this was a painting that was made in 1818, right when Frederick Hope was about 20 years old, or just past, when he was at university, or nearly at university. So this is a very famous one of those voyages, and it took place in 1831 to 1835. It's one that changed the course of history. what's interesting is that, there was a group of people in this country at the time who were really interested in natural history, and they were using it to really frame what they knew about the world around them. Now, it was earlier in European history, and possibly, earlier in other cultures too, where people were collecting stuff, and especially if you were wealthy, you were collecting all kinds of plants, animals, stuffed animals, keeping a curious cabinet of stuff. And this is from 1599. It's a Renaissance household where they have a cabinet of curiosities. They filled their house full of this stuff. Again, this was before museums and before the public actually had access to these collections, or collections of any kind, right? This is, you had people collecting things that they were interested in, or if they had traveled, they were bringing back with them, and they were keeping. But if they were fairly wealthy, they would keep these and show them off. And this is certainly true in 19th century Britain. That's what people were doing. They were collecting all these specimens, putting them in a nice cabinet like this, and then talking to their friends about it. So Ellen and Frederick spent all their lives basically collecting, describing, pinning insects. That was their thing. And they had the means to do it. So they were quite wealthy, and they were able to spend their time doing this. As one does, you start to realize, I've invested all this time and energy in this occupation. What am I going to do with it? What's going to be my legacy? And they, because he had been at Oxford, was keen to donate this collection to the Ashmolean so that it would be protected, because they had this massive collection. So through some negotiation with the vice chancellor at the time, they managed this massive donation of insects, which actually helped to inspire the university to fund the Natural History Museum. So it was in part this massive donation which made them think that it was really important that we should set this up. And in addition to that, they also endowed a chair, which is the Hope Chair of Entomology, with £10,000 at the time, so that they had someone to look after the collection. So they knew that once they made this massive collection, they needed people to actually look after it, or someone would just chuck it. And fortunately, they didn't. So they endowed it. The current collection that's housed here in the Natural History Museum is about 3.5 million specimens, which is really formidable, actually. And there are many type specimens here that were donated in part by Hope himself, but by the work of many other entomologists. So it's a very valuable collection. Just note the time. So he donated in 1849, but it took the university quite a long time to actually build this museum. It was 1855 when they actually broke the ground, and 5 years later they have this really beautiful museum. And it was really the first of its kind in Britain, and possibly one of the first in the world. Now, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew it's been around for quite a long time, but it wasn't open to the public until 1840. So at about 1840, you started to have a population of people that was interested in natural history and that would want to come out to visit these collections. And so in 1840, they opened Kew. So it was quite timely to have this natural history museum. It was a very exciting time to study natural history and to learn about natural history, because it was very important for a deeper understanding of our origins. And just to put it in perspective, the Natural History Museum in London wasn't opened until 1881. It was still, all of the natural history that they had associated with the British Museum and with Parliament was actually stored in the British Museum, not in the Natural History Museum. But you can see there's some similarity here. So they obviously had a very nice pattern that they then expanded upon. And let the riffraff in. So that's me. And for my students in the audience, that was me at about the age of 21. You can tell that at the time that, these sort of bulky kind of Harris tweed jackets were in. Right? I've got all my kit. This is the last day that I'd spent at the Natural History Museum. I had the fortune to come across as an exchange student from my university, and I was working with an entomologist named Scott Shaw at the University of Wyoming, who had lots of contacts. He was a taxonomist, had lots of contacts in the entomology section, and he managed a 3-month internship for me there. So I had the keys to the place, and so I went in every day to study insects and to learn my taxonomy there. And this was my last day. I've got all my kit with me and my book of stuff. This was before cell phones and before you could take pictures of stuff. So And it was actually when I was in this museum that through the contacts that I had there, I called George McGavin, and I came to Oxford to visit because I thought, oh, it would be interesting to come here maybe as a student. So I came over, and so that was the first time that I had come to Oxford, was actually to the Natural History Museum to visit George. So now just to go back to what I was saying before, the reason that all this stuff in this Natural History Museum were really important at the time was in part because there was a body of people that were beginning to understand that there was some pattern to what they were seeing in the fossils that they collected and in the animals that they collected in different places. And foremost among them was this very handsome fellow with the nice sideboards and the heavy brow, whom hopefully most of you recognize. It was his really important contribution to science, which was published, by the way, in 1859, the year before the opening of the Natural History Museum. So there was a critical mass of people and a deeper understanding that was evolving, for lack of a better word, which then was released on the scene and was really making everyone pay attention. It was a very important existential question at the time about how we came to be on Earth and how life around us came to be on Earth. And so it was a really exciting and very interesting time. And the origin of the Hope Chair was at this time when they started to realize that natural history was really quite important. So the first Hope Chair was John Obadiah Westwood. He was a good friend of Frederick Hope and about 10 years younger than him. And he did loads of illustrations of lots of Hope's collection. He was, in fact, an amazing painter. And this is one of his paintings from a book that he wrote called Entomologia Arcana, or Arcana Entomologia. And he was, again, the first chair here, and a really interesting guy. He actually thought that Darwin didn't know what he was talking about, unfortunately, embarrassingly, but he was a brilliant artist. And in fact, I'll show you a few more of his paintings. And he also was a taxonomist who, he worked in all kinds of different taxa, so he didn't limit himself to one order. But in fact, he worked with the leps and bees and all sorts and described many type specimens. But he had this really interesting quotation, which I read about, which I thought would be fun to tell you today. So he says, I go to London regularly to attend the meetings of the Entomological Society, or I should die of ennui here. There is no sympathy for entomology or even general zoology amongst the heads of houses. The professors, tutors, fellows of colleges have something else to do and do not care for an interloper among them, such as I. We can see that after 160 years, little has changed. No, I feel very appreciated, actually. But I did think that was rather amusing. There was apparently a lot of controversy over the importance of having a professor who was just studying the insects. But it has proved to be important, and I hope that you understand, pardon the pun, how important it might be at the end of this talk. So insects are the most diverse group of animals on Earth. There are 5.5 million species on Earth, and just to put this in perspective, there are only 6.5 thousand mammal species. So there are millions of insect species, many of which have not actually yet been described. Now, this was good news for Hope. Would have kept him in business for quite a long time. Most of the insects are beetles. So they're a very diverse group of animals. The Hymenoptera, of which the bees are a member of this order, make up only 3% of the diversity of insects. But they're an important 3%, as you will find out, if you don't already know. These are more of the beautiful paintings of John Westwood. And these are all hand-painted. I mean, he made these incredible pieces of art in this book that I was taking photographs of. And what I want you to take away from this art is that insects and plants go hand in hand. Their evolutionary history is long and intricate. And and so I think it's very important that I actually give you a bit more of the history of the world and start with the plants in order to explain why bees are important. This is the best I could do from John Westwood's paintings of a bee. This is not actually a bee, this is a wasp, but it looks kind of like a bee. I couldn't find any bees in there. He did actually do some descriptions of bee species. This is a beautiful Australian species from the genus Nomia. But as I said, what I want to do now is to give you some importance. And you came to this talk to hear about bees. And so, but I feel that it's very important that we start at the beginning. 350 million years ago, which is a very long time ago, there were plants, and they looked like this, we think. They were mostly ferns, tree ferns, and members of the gymnosperms. So the first plants were gymnosperms. The oldest are the Welwitschia, right, and the cycads, and I don't know how to say this word, Nataceae. These are very ancient lineage, but the other gymnosperms that you probably know and which we more commonly encounter are the pine trees and the spruce tree, or the cypress trees and the ginkgos. So these are the early plants, and all of these plants, and this is a Welwitschia, the really weird proto-plant from South Africa. In the gymnosperms, they have these inflorescences, in quotes. This is a male, so this is the pollen-bearing bit, and this is the female bit. And they are entirely wind-pollinated. So what's interesting about them is that they produce tons of pollen. If you have hay fever, then you're assaulted by this wind pollination. But they have to produce quite a lot of pollen to actually get fertilization of the cones. So there's a ton of wind-borne pollen. And that was typical for millions of years. Okay, millions and millions and millions of years went by, and wind pollination was the norm. The cycads are quite interesting. And in the fossil record, we begin to have a hint that there might be some kind of animal interference. So about 200 million years ago, we start to see these creatures called the Paleodictyopteroidea, which look a bit like a cross between a mayfly and a dragonfly. And there's some evidence that they might have been eating the pollen from these cones. So there's been pollen associated with them in the fossil record. They might have been the first to pollinate. In other words, they were going to these wind-pollinated structures and eating the pollen that was present. It was not intended by the plant for this food to be eaten by any insect, but the insect started to cotton on that there might be something valuable, and so they were going there to eat it. And so by going from one inflorescence to another, they were spreading pollen. Now, it's interesting, in the fossil record, you start to see at about the same time these other types of plants which may have been precursors to the angiosperms, and those are the flowering plants. This is a sort of what might be some kind of inflorescence, and these are maybe petals or tepals that are hanging down. This was from a really nice book called The Dawn of Angiosperms, which I can highly recommend. It's very interesting. This same group in China that's been working through these fossil records have been describing very strange fossils, including those from this particular order, the Pentoxylales. It's very interesting, this inflorescence. It hangs upside down, it appears. It has ovules like this and a kind of opening here. This is not something that you might associate with wind pollination. And what's even more interesting is that they started to find fossils of animals that might be pollinators. This is an ancient scorpion fly lineage, whose lineage does not now exist. And it has these weird mouth parts that extend way down like this. It's like a solid structure. And it also is associated with pollen. So they can find pollen grains associated with it in the fossils that they find. And the people that found these fossils and studied them were hypothesizing that this animal was actually trying to access the gumminess on the stigma of these flowers. So there are sugars and other types of nice oligosaccharides and proteins on this. And they hypothesized that this animal was trying to get a hold of them here. Not actually eating the pollen, but rather trying to get the sugar. Interestingly, it's got pretty big wings, and it was clearly doing quite a lot of flying. This is important later. But there are animals in existence now, in particular these flies from South Africa, that have very elongate proboscis. They're not a proboscis that they can retract, but rather it's this very long structure they have to fly around with and then try to point into the flower. So we know that insects can do it. And it's quite a tricky thing to do, but it's likely that this scorpion fly was actually a pollinator. This is a very, very recent study that I found when I was constructing this talk, which I thought was very interesting and nice to share. What they did is they used a model, and they were looking at all these different fossils to try to understand when the angiosperms actually emerged in the fossil record. And for a long time, the kind of dogma, because we didn't know better, was that the angiosperms appeared dramatically at about 145 million years ago. But what they found is that there's a sort of slow creep over time of things that look like angiosperms, and then boom, you get this massive change in the Cretaceous period, basically, where you start to see this huge increase in diversity of the angiosperms. So there was maybe a kind of long tail here where insects and other animals might have been getting involved with plants and with flowers and eating pollen and spreading pollen to floral parts. And then what happened was a very interesting innovation. So 145 million years ago, we see clear evidence that there are angiosperms that we recognize as flowering plants in the fossil record. And these are the early flowering plants, the lovely lotus flowers that we love, the Amborales and the Austrobaileales. Sorry, as I butcher all of these names. The origin of the angiosperms started with these massive flowers. They were, that had very specific characteristics. And there's also another very nice recent study of the characteristics of early angiosperms. What we start to see is that you get these inflorescences that are clearly a visual display to some animal. You start to see that the flowers themselves are actually bisexual, so the male and female parts are located in the same place. They're not separated as you often see in the gymnosperms. So you start to see this sort of proto or early flower. It looks very much like this, with a clear visual display and the sexual parts located near to one another. And indeed, this is a lily flower. Here's your anthers full of pollen. Here's the stigma, and this is the part that is receptive to the pollen. And you can see the little pollen grains on the stigma sticking there. That's how most of our modern plants fertilized. And then the pollen grains, they basically grow down the style and they fertilize the ovary here. And that's sexual reproduction in a nutshell in flowering plants. So what you see, that's your basic innovation that's occurring here, is that you start to see the location of these sexual parts in the flower much closer to each other, and you start to see that there are adaptations which are clearly signals to someone outside. And in 135 million years ago, we get the emergence of the magnolids, and the beautiful magnolias that we see around town, actually in springtime, are members of that group. And again, they have a very similar structure to the nymphalids, these very early plants. They have these very large petals, very clear floral display. But what's interesting is there are some slight changes. One of those is that they actually produce copious amounts of pollen. They have this massive display that also includes an olfactory signal, a clear olfactory signal, which is not just the smell of the pollen, but rather an independent olfactory signal that is produced by the plant to lure someone. And you also find a sort of sugary exudate on the petals themselves. It's not nectar per se, but rather it's kind of the cells themselves rupture and produce this sugar on the outside. These are all indications that the plant is doing something to lure others to come. And at the time, 135 million years ago, there's some evidence in the fossil record that who was coming to these flowers were beetles. So the beetles are pollinivores. The adult beetles would come and eat this very nutrient-rich pollen and then spread it from inflorescence to inflorescence more efficiently than wind. There was this very interesting point here, which I noted before, where you've got to kind of drift upwards, and then suddenly this huge change. And that was 125 million years ago. And that expansion included all of the flowering plants that we know today. So the eudicot group, basically monocots, the ceratophyllales, which is a water plant group, and the eudicots. And this is by far the most diverse group of plants on Earth. The eudicots are very diverse. And this was called eudicot diversification by those who've been studying it. So this is quite peculiar. There was this massive increase in angiosperm diversity was accompanied by nectar production, right, in the flower. So there's clear nectar production, and nectar production is really only for an insect visitor. The plant doesn't, it has no function for the plant otherwise. There were these elaborations of all these floral displays in all of these different plants, which include scent and color and shape, bilateral symmetry. All of this accompanied this massive diversification in the angiosperms. And what caused this? You came to hear a talk about bees, so you probably already know the answer. So this beautiful creature, you can see is landing in the flower. This one in particular is scrabbling around to try to collect some scent from the petals. But in this flower is getting both food and some, basically some extra adornment that it can use for its own sexual signaling. It's quite an intricate and close relationship that is very beneficial to the insect, but also quite obviously very, very beneficial to the plant. So in the fossil record, we begin to see bees at around 120 to 100 million years ago. And this is the oldest fossil that we have of a bee. It's called Melitosphex burmensis. And it's half wasp, half bee. And what's interesting is that they found that it was clearly associated with pollen, and they were able to identify the pollen on the animal. And interestingly, as you might predict, with the concomitant with the eudicot diversification was the expansion of the bee lineage. So the bees, we predict, came in the fossil record about 125 million years ago, and we have about 20,000 species worldwide. Most of the species are solitary bee species. They're not the eusocial ones everyone knows, and they are also pollinators. And in the UK, we have 270 native bee species. So the bees were responsible for, we think, for the diversification of the angiosperms that are very important to life on Earth now. The bee's closest ancestor was this little thrip-hunting wasp, and this was research that was done very recently by Brian Danforth's group at Cornell. They hunt these thrips, and these thrips eat all kinds of plant parts, but one of the plant parts that the thrips actually, there are some thrips that eat just floral pollen. So this little wasp was starting to eat the thrips that were eating the pollen, and then cottoned on to the fact that the pollen itself was quite a reliable food source and very valuable. Not to underscore the point, but bees are very important. 87% of the Earth's plant diversity is angiosperms. That's most of the plants on Earth. 70% of the angiosperms are the eudicots. And 96% of all global vegetation is an angiosperm. So 96%, that's almost all the plants on Earth are angiosperms. 70% of the world's crops depend on pollination. They are angiosperms, and they depend on some form of pollination. Now, by depend, I'm loosely saying they get a better yield if there is a pollinator involved. Some crops are completely dependent on it, like almonds. Others just improve their fruit set when pollinators are involved. But these are fruits from many different angiosperm species. So why bees? Why were bees involved, and why would this innovation have occurred? Bees are highly efficient vectors of pollen. They distribute pollen widely, they fly for miles, and they also need to produce less pollen and can exist in smaller, sparser populations. So these are all reasons why a plant might want to have a bee as a pollinator. And this diversification allowed plants to then colonize many different habitats. So there was more outcrossing, greater diversity, and greater adaptability. Plants were then able to colonize all sorts of habitats throughout the world as a result of this, being able to spread pollen quite efficiently. What motivated bees to be involved in this relationship? Of course, it's food. So nectar, which was plentiful and predictable and valuable, and pollen, which was also very nutritious. Nectar, as I said, has one function, and it's to lure pollinators. It really is a reward, and in fact, it's the essential fuel for a flying insect. It's Also, bees eat pollen to obtain the very critical nutrients that they need to rear larvae, and that include proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Bees also collect the pollen and transport it back to actually establish colonies or to keep their larvae going, so it's really essential. But they've adapted to this food source. They don't eat anything else. They are peculiar and they have adapted specifically to this food source. And in fact, one of the adaptations is that in some bee species, they actually have formed structures just for the collection and the transport of pollen, including this corbicula. Bee larvae also eat pollen as their main source of nutrition. And so this is an Osmia rufa. It's a little solitary bee, and it's feeding its larva on a pollen ball that its mother has collected. These are honeybees. And this is a honeybee colony full of nice larvae that are all being fed with royal jelly or worker jelly that's derived from pollen. They also are fed some pollen. And interestingly, honeybees actually produce the milk that they feed to their larvae from the pollen that they eat. Now, there are loads of solitary bee species. They are very beautiful and very diverse. And they have these really great colors, and their eyes in some of these species are very beautiful, but they are by far the most diverse group. They are solitary because they do not form large colonies, but rather the females mate and then rear their own group of larvae on the pollen that they supply in a nest. There are the famous eusocial species. There are 380 eusocial species. 11 of these are Apis, the well-known honeybee. So there are only 11 species of honeybee on Earth. The other eusocial species are bombus and some of the others, stingless bees. In a honeybee colony or in a eusocial bee colony, what you find is you have one reproductive queen. That's the queen here in this picture. She's got this blue tag on her, and she's the one that lays all the eggs. She mates. In the eusocial colony, you have loads of workers who are involved in rearing the larvae, and they are sterile. And that's why this is a true social or a eusocial situation, because you have only one reproductive female, but loads of workers who help. And then you also have drones, who are the males, who mate with future queens. And a queen mates once in her lifetime. She mates with up to 20 different drones. She mates only in flight. She stores all of their sperm and can live for several years, laying eggs using the sperm in her spermatheca. These are the three different casts that I just showed you, just to emphasize the size. The queen is large, the drone is also large, and the workers are relatively smaller. But they make up the largest population within the colony. The eusocial species were interesting because they were a confound to Darwin and his theory of evolution. They were a confound because you have a group who are working together for their own good. And it looked like a really nice communist commune, and he couldn't understand how such a thing could evolve in light of natural selection. So this was one of his conundrums, was really trying to understand how could this have ever evolved? A situation where a female basically gives up her own reproductive fitness to rear the offspring of loads of others, of her sisters. This conundrum was solved in part, or actually originally, by Bill Hamilton, who was a professor here starting in the 1980s. And Bill Hamilton was actually more a modeler and an economist who came to biology later. And he formed Hamilton's rule as part of his PhD. And basically, he said that altruism evolves in a honeybee colony when there's a certain set of conditions. And those conditions are when the relatedness of two individuals and the fitness benefit to the receiver of an act is actually greater than the cost to the giver of that particular act. And it turns out that this type of eusocial situation can evolve in only certain situations. So maybe not in this situation, okay? Here they are related by 0.5%. The question is, would Harry have anything to do with William's child, given that he's only going to receive a benefit of 0.25? Would they form a eusocial colony? Well, what Bill realized was that in haplodiploid animals, you have a clear situation where the fitness can be very, very high indeed if they're all sisters and they are closely related. That's because any female in the colony receives one of her sex chromosomes from the male and one of them, or actually one of her sex chromosomes from the male and one from the female. And so all of the sisters in the colony are actually more closely related than they would be if they were sorry, I'm going to start this again. All of the sisters in a colony that have the same father will be more closely related than they would be if they were normal diploid animals. So you can have a situation where they can be sisters where they have different fathers and their relatedness is 0.5 because of their mother, or they could have a situation where they all share the same father and the same mother, and they could be related quite a lot by 0.75. In that case, the benefit that you have to giving and looking after your sister's offspring is actually greater than you would have having your own children and looking after them. And so in this situation, you find that eusociality evolves. And this haplodiploidy has allowed this to evolve in several different times in this lineage, and we have 380 different species of eusocial bees, many of which are very, very beautiful indeed. So over 125 million years, many specializations in plants and in bees have evolved, from an orchid, which is the most diverse of the monocots, and to passion flower flowers, to the largest flower, which is actually also pollinated by little sweat bees, to all kinds of other strange inventions that plants have co-evolved. That one's for you, Dan. This particular animal is very beautiful and really amazing. And I thought I would just briefly introduce you to her if you've never met them. This is an orchid bee. These orchid bees are found in the neotropics. From the collections here in the Hope Entomology collection, you get very, very tiny little orchid bees that look like this and very, very large ones. And orchid bees are just incredibly beautiful. They're possibly some of the most beautiful insects with their metallic colors in all different shades. And these beautifully adorned animals collect scent from flowers. And the males collect the scent in order to make a perfume to lure the females. So they have also this very beautiful romantic lifestyle, where the males, they're going from flower to flower to try to scrape the scent off of these plants, to put it into these little pollen or areas on their back legs where they store it in order to lure a female to mate. And this is a nice video of males all gathering at this orchid in flower to collect the scent. Now, they become pollinators by happenstance in this situation when they contact in certain orchid species the polonia, the pollen sacs of the plant. Sometimes they have to crawl through special structures to get through to get the scent, or they fall into a structure and unwittingly become pollinators when this stuff attaches to their back. And then they have to crawl out, and then they go around to get more scent from another orchid of the same species, and they are delivering the pollen, a large pollen load in a very specific way. So that's, and they have created an incredibly diverse set of plants. It's the most diverse, I believe, in all of the plant lineages, the orchids. And they are very beautiful. And you can see clearly that the eye of a bee has been involved in the design of these plants. There are 25,000 different species of orchid. So 2002, that was me. I was starting to learn about bees at Ohio State University, and I did this bee bikini with a good friend of mine, Sue Kobe, who is a bee breeder. And that was a trip. It's very hot, actually. It's like you're dripping with sweat because the bees are so hot. I didn't get stung in that event. In 2005, that's when I started learning about bees, or actually before that, but that was taken in 2005. 2002. 2005, this is me. I'd just come to Northumberland. You see these beautiful fields in the north of England. And I started my lab at Newcastle University, 2005. That's how it looked. They're the workers, right? Those are my first workers. In 2006, we start to hear in the news that bee colonies are in decline and bees are under threat. And beekeepers in the US were finding piles of bees on the outside of their colonies, all in massive piles. And we start hearing about this term called colony collapse disorder. And 2006 was also a momentous year for the publication of a very important paper by some friends, Koos Biesmeyer and Bill Kunin and their colleagues. they had been studying, using the records from museums of this kind to look at the bee fauna over time, and then going out to different areas of the UK and in the Netherlands to sample these bees. And they found that there was a massive decrease in the populations that they expected to find in these areas, both in the UK and the Netherlands. And the way that they were able to do this, again, is because there were records that were kept in museums of the different kinds of bees they could find and their relative populations. So this paper, it made a huge splash because it was a warning, basically, to say, whoa, loads of bees are in decline all over. What's going on? And it actually provoked the UK to fund an initiative, which I was the beneficiary in my lab, called the UK Insect Pollinators Initiative. This Pollinators Initiative put money to understand the reasons that bees were in decline. And so I got some money to actually study bee nutrition and also how pesticides influence bee populations, or bees in general, and the mechanisms. So it was a very important paper, and actually it sounded the alarm. You all probably know about bee decline because of this particular work and colony collapse. So bees really are, this decline is real, and I'm going to show you a little bit of data to support this. But bees are really acting like the canary in the coal mine. This is a really interesting structure that was built by a British physician and physiologist named J.S. Haldane, who was the father of the famous geneticist Haldane. And he invented the respirator, but he also invented this contraption for taking this little bird into the coal mine. And this was a bird that was saving the lives of miners, because there were, as coal mines, people were in the pit and they were mining, they were encountering all these noxious gases, including CO2, and dying. So loads of people were dying, and he realized that because he was doing physiology of this, that if you were doing experiments with birds or with mice, that they were much more sensitive to CO2, and so if you put them in this little contraption, whenever the canary falls over, you know you need to get out. So this was a really interesting contraption that was built for that, but that's an aside. Really, bees are the canary in the coal mine right now. We're experiencing a huge loss of insect biodiversity across the UK and across the world. This was from a study published in 2014, and you can see clearly that there are certain species, as much as 40% or more of the odonata, the dragonflies, the leps, the ants, and the beetles are actually in decline. We're losing populations, so we're losing abundance, but we're also losing the richness of these insects. And part of this is due to the fact that we actually lost 90% of our lowland grassland and hay meadows from 1932 to 1984. There was a massive change in the way that we did agriculture in this country, and it led to a massive change in the plant diversity. In fact, plant diversity dropped quite a lot, and in particular, plant diversity that was supporting bee populations dropped a lot. So a lot of bee forage plants and their abundance disappeared. And bees have a massive impact on plants because they are fertilizing plants. So when plant populations disappear, bee populations also disappear. And then the remaining plants don't necessarily have the pollinators that they need to do the pollination service. So you get this sort of vicious circle. And part of what we see now is that we have agricultural intensification. And in fact, most of the hay meadows that we had are now these pasture lands that are heavily fertilized to produce grass for animals that we eat. And agricultural intensification is really largely to blame for the change in biodiversity. We see that we're basically relying on a lot more on fertilizers, pesticides. We've changed the plant diversity. We've changed the soil and other habitat so that the animals don't have a place to nest. And our waterways are also polluted with these compounds that we're using to do this agricultural intensification. These are things that are having a massive effect on biodiversity in Europe and around the world. And this is just an example of a study that was published in 2017. They were doing a survey just of the insect biomass found in nature reserves in Germany. And they were finding this is the decrease in the biomass over time in these nature reserves in Germany. It's a massive decrease, actually, over time, of 75%, actually. What's interesting is that this was concomitant with the licensing of this compound, a neonicotinoid, which has been widely used throughout Europe. It's very interesting that they correlate. Neonicotinoids, which you've probably heard about, are actually used to protect many crops, including oilseed rape. When they are in the crop, they wind up in pollen and nectar, and then bees contact them. And the bees, when they are unwittingly collecting nectar and pollen, also are consuming some of these compounds. These compounds affect acetylcholine receptors in the brain and the nervous system, and insects are full of these. This is one of their major forms of neurotransmission, is using acetylcholine receptors. And so this highly super ligand or super agonist of this receptor is this neonicotinoid pesticide. And some of the work that was done in my lab in Newcastle found that if you add the field relevant concentrations of these compounds to sugar and you feed it to bees and you give them a choice, they can't detect it in the solution. And what's more, when they drink it, they like it, and so they go back for more. So not only does it actually affect them and cause paralysis, but it acts like a drug in a way, because it actually makes them think the food is more rewarding, because it's activating neurons in their brain, we think, that are involved in reward. So it's the kryptonite of bees, unfortunately. And many studies, including those from my lab and several others, have now shown that neonicotinoids affect all manner of the behavior of bees, from the way that they process olfactory or gustatory signals, to the way they navigate, their motor function, how their immune function and their ability to withstand disease. They're bad compounds that have caused a lot of damage. What's more, people who have studied bird life have also found that there's a strong correlation between imidacloprid used and the decline in bird life, and also tulips. The study was done in the Netherlands. But that's because, not because these are agonists of the receptors of birds, but rather because all the bird's food is insects. So when you kill off all the insects, you kill off all the birds too. We know now that 30% of European bird species and their populations are declining, and 1 out of 5 species are threatened with extinction in Europe. So it's not a good situation. The tropical rainforests of the world contain half of the world's insect biodiversity. They're extremely diverse and very rich habitats, really exciting places to visit, actually. Only 15% of these species have been named. And yet we know also that in these other habitats that the insect orders are in decline, and that both the abundance and the richness of species is disappearing. And part of the reason for that is this. As you've probably heard from the news, a lot of rainforest is being burned, a lot more of it is being lost every year. We were arresting the reduction of tropical rainforest for a while, but recently things have been speeding up again, and we're starting to lose a lot of it again. In the last 20 years or so, we've lost 6% of the land that was forested. That's 6% of the world's land that was forested, so it's quite a large amount. And when we lose so much area, we lose species too. And in fact, because the tropical species are not very well documented, we don't actually know how many of them we've lost. We don't have the same beautiful records we have here, where we know how many insects were passing over this piece of land for the past 160 years. We have great records here, but in those places we don't. And we're losing them before we know about them. And this is just to put things in perspective. 38% of the terrestrial habitat on Earth is used for agriculture. So almost 40% of the land is used in agriculture. And we're losing 24 million hectares per year at the moment of tropical forest, and that's roughly the area of the UK. And with that, we start to lose species. 25% of the terrestrial habitat of the Earth is used for pasture land, right? So it's not just in agriculture, it's actually pasture that's being used for animals. And livestock are actually responsible for producing more emissions in the form of gas, literally, than all forms of transport, planes, buses, and cars. This is a picture of Indonesian rainforest that's been destroyed for creation of palm oil. I was interested to know who's buying the palm oil. Everybody's like saying, don't use a palm oil. It's actually really India that's heavily using palm oil. Other nations are too, but not on the order that India is. Raising cattle for beef is the #1 cause of tropical deforestation, especially in the neotropics, in Brazil and in Paraguay. In 2018 alone, 12 million acres were cleared. 81% of that was in the Brazilian Amazon, the very rich and very species diverse place. And the cattle that are being raised there are mainly going to China and to the EU. So these cows are being raised on this pasture land and then shipped to other areas of the world. A lot of the tropical forest in Brazil has been cleared to produce soy. These are soy fields, and there's your nice rainforest. This soy is going to Europe, largely, and it's going to feed our cows, our pigs, and our chickens. 80% of the soy that's raised there feeds farmed animals, and 10 million tons is imported to the EU annually. So our thirst for meat, or lust for meat, is really driving tropical deforestation. And this is just to educate you a bit, so that you know, whenever you eat meat, what you're doing. This is tofu. For every gram of protein you get from tofu, you've got 1 gram of, or basically this is your 1-to-1 relationship between grams of soy protein to produce a gram of meat, and your meat here is tofu. So you need 3 grams of soy to produce 1 gram of chicken, 9 grams of soy to produce 1 gram of pig, and 32 to produce 1 gram of meat from a cow. This is the emission of methane per unit protein. It's 20 parts for 1 gram of protein, 20 for pigs, but you can see that this is a methane-producing machine. As our population goes up, the extinction of other animals goes up. It's very simple. We need protein, we need food. There are lots of us. We create more land to feed more people. And so we're using that land to then create more people. And what happens when we lose the habitat for wild plants? Well, it's not just as simple as, we're just now creating it all for the animals we eat. When we're doing this, we're actually eroding our own habitat on Earth. When we start to lose tropical forests, we're not just losing insect biodiversity that we might care about but not really understand why it's valuable. We lose the production of oxygen, the removal of CO2. Actually, when you start to create this kind of system, the soil itself, the microbes in the soil change and they produce more methane. And what's happening is that we're losing species that actually might also be valuable to us as food sources, as medicine sources, that may be pollinators of our crops. We also know now that in models that the forest itself actually affects weather systems and global rainfall. So as we lose this, it's going to affect weather patterns throughout the world. It's really quite a dire situation that we need to pay attention to, and it's why I devoted the subject of this talk to this insect biodiversity. And what's more, when we lose functional ecosystems, we lose the services they provide us. So when we start to kill all the insects in our fields using this easy-to-come-by pesticide, which is a really great short-term win for the companies and really easy for the farmers to use, we're losing all the services they provide to us too. And that includes the pollination, because a lot of the pollination is not done by honeybees or by domesticated bees. It's done by wild bee species. So the pollination of our crops are done mostly by wild species. And some of them are quite specific and really excellent pollinators. And without them, we don't get the crop yields that we would expect to get. This is a really nice study that shows clearly how the impact of wild bee species on different crops. Almonds, they're not so important. We use a lot of honeybees to do that. But on all these other fruits that we care about that are an important part of our diet, wild bee species are playing a role. I mean, in some cases, they are the main pollinator of any of these squash. They're really very important in comparison to cultivated bee species. So wild pollinators are important, and hence other insects too. But we ignore them, unfortunately, or we have historically. What can we do? Of course, I don't want to just, tell you not to be a meat eater. I'm actually here to try to empower you to do something about this. Every one of us can make decisions in our lives that then impact everything else on Earth. We're living in a time where that's certainly the case. And right now we're eating too much meat. It's not just that we're eating meat, we're eating too much of it. Anybody can reduce the amount of meat they eat in their diet. And this is a really interesting map because it tells you who the culprits are for the overconsumption of meat by far. All the very red areas certainly are eating too much per capita. But you really put it in context when you actually know how much protein you need to have every day. I mean, I study nutrition, so I, of course, cared about my own nutrition. I wanted to know this. But this is for you to know in the future. every person needs 0.6 of a gram of protein per kilogram of body mass per day. That's your base rate of protein. That's what you need to stay alive and stay, decent. If you're exercising, you might double this amount, okay? And what I've done is I've used Dewey Vandermeer, Scotland won yesterday, as my example. He's 105 kilograms and 6'4" tall. He's huge. He needs a lot of protein. And so I calculated what he would need on a daily basis. He needs about 63 grams of protein per day. If he's exercising, he needs maybe 126. Maybe if he's trying to build a lot of muscle so that he can help Scotland win, then he has to eat, maybe he would multiply that by 3 or 4 times. Maybe at the most it would be, at the very most, 230 grams of protein a day. That's a lot of protein. And a UK person, right, who is maybe 60 kilograms, closer to my size, really doesn't need that much, okay? But a person from the UK at the moment, on average, eats about 103 grams of protein a day, okay? This is about 2.5 times what we actually need. And if you look, again, at what's being consumed in all these different countries, okay? I had to convert pounds to kilograms here. But in the US, where I'm from, your average person eats 99 kilograms of meat every year. That's a lot. They get 270 grams of protein a day. They aren't, bodybuilding, everyone. It's a lot of protein. Europeans, 170 grams a day, and in the UK, it's 103. So at least in the UK, we can feel virtuous, amongst these nations. We're eating less, but still eating a lot, probably more than we need every day. And it's not just that. A lot of the meat that we produce is wasted. If this is from the FAO, they estimate that 20% of all the meat we produce is wasted. 35% of the seafood that we collect is wasted, and we all know that there's a huge impact on the sea and on all these marine species of fishing, and a lot of it's wasted. It's not even eaten. If you care about the future of the Earth and a future of life on Earth, you need to eat less meat, and you need to be more conscious of what you are eating. And we, as a group of very intelligent people, need to invest our time and our energy in trying to find ways to create protein sources which are not animal products, and eat them, even if they're not very nice, but surely some of us, we can make them better. I'm surely improve and change our palates. Otherwise, we're facing a very difficult situation. We have too many people on Earth, really. We need to do something about our population. And what's more, we need to invest in the human capital that we have now. We need to invest in the children we have now so that they are well educated, so that they have the things they need, so that they can make good decisions, and we don't have this crazy out-of-control population. Part of that is going to, again, revolve around personal choice. And it's also going to involve women and trying to empower women in many different nations of the world to have control of their destiny, because we know when we invest in women, the children have a lot better resources. We have fewer people on Earth, right, but better resourced people, better educated people who make better decisions and who don't ruin the Earth. We live in a time that is a global market. It's a big market. We don't live alone on an island, even though it feels like it sometimes. We actually live in a global market where we depend on many different nations for the food, for the clothes, for everything we have. And it may feel like, when you hear impending doom, that we should shrink away and shrink and close our borders and rely on ourselves. But it's actually the opposite of what we need to do right now. We need to act like bees. We need to come together and realize that our fate is dependent on our mutual cooperation. We have to work with other countries that have this biodiversity in these places to make sure that it isn't being destroyed. And really, we need to look and work to be better stewards of the land that we have. And in fact, we can help the bees in our backyard. We can do it by improving habitat for pollinators and other insects. We can do it by stop using these general pesticides. We have the technology to be specific about how we kill our insect pests. We don't have to rely on these general pesticides. And this is going to take major changes in the way that governments approach this. It takes initiatives amongst the population that actually help to push this in the right direction. And we can also feed our domesticated bees with foods that are made for them, and at least that's some small way that my group is trying to help, so that the honeybees aren't competing just with the solitary bees for the food that they might naturally get. I am coming to the end of this. I know you've been sitting here patiently. So this is a particularly important week. It's this global climate summit that's occurring in this country. And it's also Remembrance Day on Wednesday. And Remembrance Day is the 11th hour, or on the 11th day of the 11th month. It was a time when, we're meant to actually just pause for us, even just a minute, to reflect on the fact that our corporate decisions in democracies sometimes make wrong decisions, which really have strong impacts on many people. Over 20 million people died in World War I. They were senseless, completely pointless deaths. And this is the symbol of that remembrance. And this symbol has a history. And I'd like you to remember on Remembrance Day what little creature helped to produce this beautiful thing that is the symbol of our remembrance. Our human lives are valuable, but other life on this planet is also valuable. And it's important for us to realize it before it's too late. And I'd like to think, actually, did you notice there's a Hymenoptera here? I don't know. It could be a bee, but I don't think it is. I'd like to thank the benefactors for this great privilege and position and chance to do research and to be in a university where we can study these things and warn ourselves before it's too late. But it's also, it's just such a wonderful place to be, a university with all of you. And thank you, audience, for coming today.
Please rise.